Good afternoon, everyone. This is the first time that I'm at a biohacker conference. It's exciting to be here. I only have half an hour, and I believe already the convention is running a little bit late, so I'm going to talk very quickly about certain specific aspects of probiotics and the research that I've looked at over the years. So I love this image. It's the image of two people covered in bacteria, because we are covered in bacteria inside and out. And it's all flowers and beautiful. So the National Institute of Health defines probiotics as live microorganisms that are similar to the ones found in our gut, that are also called friendly bacteria. And typically, they're available to consumers, to us, through supplementation as well as foods. The history of probiotics goes back to thousands of years ago, but really, Eli Metchnikoff in 1907 is the first person who looked at the use of probiotics and its contribution to health in Bulgarians. And what he found was that people who were consuming fermented dairy products seemed to have longer lives and were healthier. And he was quoted to say that health could be enhanced and senility delayed by manipulating the intestinal microbiome with host-friendly bacteria found in yogurt. In the Persian culture, in the Persian folklore stories, they attribute Abraham's longevity and his fertility to consuming sour milk, which is basically yogurt. And in Roman times, they used to use fermented dairy products for the treatment of digestive issues. Streptococcus haemophilus and Lactobacilli bulgaricus are two strains that have been used, or ingested, I should say, by humans in fermented dairy products for thousands of years. And of course, in our times, probiotics are getting a lot of attention. There's lots of studies now on the use of probiotics and the treatment of various conditions and disorders. And the evidence is very strong in terms of even preventing certain disorders. So what I've done is I have shared the abstract of all the studies that I've used to put this talk together in my presentation. I thought you guys were going to get all a copy of the presentations, but I don't know how that works. But I won't have time to go over all the studies, but basically the importance of what's written in the studies is in my slides. So we are all exposed to bacteria at the time of birth. When babies are going through the birth canal, they get exposed to the mother's bacteria. And this starts a series of reactions in their gut that eventually leads to them producing bacteria in their own gut. Of course, not all children are born naturally anymore. Many children are born through C-section. And of course, when that happens, they're not exposed to that bacteria. The other thing that's interesting is we used to consume a lot more probiotic foods because the way we would preserve foods was by fermenting them. And of course, we don't do that as much anymore. So we're not getting as much of the good bacteria, even from birth, as we used to. So I'm going to talk about the human microbiome, and I love this slide. It says the Human Microbiome Project says the human body, has 100 trillion microscopic life forms living in it. And the bacteria are saying, you call this living? So in 2014, the media and scientific community reported that we have about 100 trillion bacterial cells in our body, and we have about 10 trillion human cells. In 2016, at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, they modified that number, and they estimated that the number of bacteria on our body is about 39 trillion, and the number of cells in our body is about 30 trillion. Whichever way you look at it, we have more bacteria than we have human cells. And this is really interesting and important because just on our skin and our digestive tract, we have over 2,000 different types of bacteria. And these are some of the studies that looked at the human microbiome. So some of the benefits of bacteria. Bacteria have so many different benefits. There's so many studies. I couldn't talk about all of them in 30 minutes. So these are some of them that I'm going to look at with you guys this afternoon. Certainly, the importance of bacteria in gut health, we're all aware of that. I think most people know about, irritable bowel syndrome and taking probiotics, although I have to say that in many people with irritable bowel syndrome, probiotics can also aggravate the symptoms, but in a large majority, probiotics could certainly help the symptoms. Probiotics also help improve our immune system. They can even help prevent infection, destroy harmful bacteria. But most importantly, the relationship between the gut and the brain over the last 20 years has been studied and looked at, and how probiotics can help improve things like anxiety and depression, how they can help reduce inflammation, maintain healthy skin, lower blood pressure, and even improve diabetes. Probiotics in our gut are also responsible for producing a number of different vitamins and also butyrate, which is anti-inflammatory. And these are all the studies that looked at sort of the different areas that the bacteria can be used at. And so the question is, what influences the health of our gut flora? So genetics play a big role. What we inherit from our parents plays a big role, but also the macrobiome, the environment plays a big role, and of course, the diet and the lifestyle and the dietary habits of the individual also play a big role. Having said that, though, there are certain things that destroy the gut flora. So overconsumption of sugar destroys the gut flora. Smoking, obviously, destroys the gut flora. Overconsumption of alcoholic beverages, poor sleep hygiene, lack of exercise, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later, emotional stress. Stress seems to aggravate everything. But also consumption of GMO foods, and specifically glyphosate, which is also called Roundup. Roundup exposure, they've looked at it in studies, animal and human studies. It actually destroys the good bacteria in the gut. And chlorination and oversanitation also contribute to poor development of the good bacteria in our gut. So this doctor is telling the patient, I see the problem. Your gut macrobiome is out of balance. One moment. I think you mean microbiome, right? No, here, swallow this. That's a wolf. Do you need a glass of water? So basically, the importance of macrobiome in the health of our gut flora. So nowadays, everywhere we go, any store you go to, you can buy probiotics. All grocery stores in Canada have probiotics. Health food stores, pharmacies, everywhere you go, you can get probiotics. But let's look and see what is the evidence behind the use of probiotics for specific conditions. For GI disorders, there are literally hundreds of, well, not hundreds, but many studies that talk about the importance of probiotics in for the health of the GI tract. Having said that, though, the evidence is stronger for things like ulcerative colitis as opposed to Crohn's. Crohn's, especially in its active form, sometimes can be aggravated when people take probiotics. So perhaps waiting until the Crohn's has subsided before administering the probiotics might be a better idea. And also, in terms of diarrhea, probiotics can be really helpful for antibiotic-associated diarrhea, as well as acute diarrhea. For travelers' diarrhea, the evidence is not quite as strong. Saccharomyces boulardii seem to be more effective, which is a probiotic yeast, seems to be more effective in the treatment of travelers' diarrhea. But certainly, probiotics can help with the eradication of H. pylori, as well as in the treatment of pouchitis. They can be used especially in higher doses for pouchitis. And they can reduce the pain and the severity of IBS in many people, but not everyone with IBS. And these are some of the studies that I had looked at to put that slide together. And in terms of skin, especially with eczema in infants or atopic dermatitis in children, probiotics can be very, very helpful. Lactobacilli casei specifically were found to reduce that antigen-specific skin inflammation. But probiotics can also be used for the treatment of acne in adults. But certainly the evidence is very strong in children for the use of atopic dermatitis. And my slide is not going forward. Okay, so obviously not all bacteria are bad. In fact, the bacteria in our gut, many of them are very important in our health. And these are the studies that I told you with acne and skin. And in terms of inflammation, in the studies that I looked at, they were looking more at symbiotics and how they regulate our immune system. We know that approximately 80% of our immune system is in the gut, so it makes sense that if someone has chronic inflammation, that you would want to address their gut as well. In the children, in elderly population, the importance of probiotics for their immune health has been shown in a couple of studies. And specifically, bifidobacteria were looked at for the treatment or for the prevention of the common cold and the flu. I really like this slide whoops. Can I go back to the slide? I didn't mean to go. Can I go to the previous slide? No, forward, please. There, that one, thank you. So you can see on your left side, the purple is all healthy bacteria, and the red are pathogenic microbes. And on your right side, you see that the microbiome is depleted, and you can see that where the microbiome is depleted, there's more microbes, more pathogenic bacteria that are able to get through. The other thing that I like about this slide is often when we talk about probiotics, we talk about overgrowth of bad bacteria, but in many instances, it's actually more about depletion of the good ones. Okay, and with respect to blood pressure and diabetes, bacteria seem to improve the lipid profile. They seem to reduce insulin resistance, regulate renin levels, and activate antioxidants. And what's interesting, in a study where they gave people probiotics for hypertension, they had to take the probiotics for about 8 weeks before they saw a change in the blood pressure of the participants. And the dose of the probiotic that was given was quite high. It was 100 billion or more CFUs, colony-forming units. So it was quite a high dose that was given to patients with blood pressure. And these are the studies about the blood pressure. And then, of course, as I said, it helps regulate blood sugar levels. Probiotics can reduce sort of the high levels of blood sugar, especially in the morning. They can help with insulin sensitivity and also decrease the autoimmune response. So they can be used in diabetic patients when they're diagnosed with diabetes, but also in people who have a strong family history of diabetes, they can be used preventatively. And those are some of the studies with diabetes. If any of you would like those studies, you can email me directly. I think I provided my email, and I'm happy to share the studies with you. With respect to obesity, we know that the microbiota in our gut have an influence on our energy homeostasis. And we know that they ultimately can control body weight. But the way they contribute to weight gain typically is that alteration in the gut flora start happening, perhaps because of having a poor lifestyle or poor diet. And then what happens is the person develops sort of this low-grade chronic inflammatory state. And over time, this can attribute to the person gaining weight and develop obesity. What's interesting is germ-free mice are protected from obesity. So the bacteria in our gut seem to make a big difference in terms of our weight. Probiotics versus antibiotics. Well, we know the short-term effect of antibiotics on the gut flora. Over the last few years, there's a body of evidence that has emerged that is showing the long-term effect that actually antibiotics can have on someone's gut flora, especially in specific people who are more susceptible. And what's interesting is when they've looked at both molecular and cultivation-based approaches, what they have found is that disturbance of taking antibiotics in people can last for quite a period of time. And so it's important when we administer antibiotics or when someone is taking antibiotics that they take probiotics. The research is still there to support being on probiotics while taking antibiotics, but now it also is supporting the fact that one has to remain on the probiotics after the antibiotic course has been fulfilled. And again, these are some of those studies. This is an area that I'm very passionate about, the relationship between the gut and our brain. And it's a bidirectional relationship. So you'll see me use both terms gut-brain and brain-gut because it goes both ways. We know that our gut is our second brain. And there is an emerging new area in study called psychobiotics, where probiotics are studied and the effects of probiotics are looked at on our brain function. There are many studies that have looked at the role of the microbiome, the gut bacteria, on things like anxiety and depression. And in one particular study, they noticed that probiotics actually helped reduce rehospitalization of people who had mania with manic depressive patients. And there's also lots of case studies, some really good case studies talking about autism and gut health. The studies that I looked at for autism were mostly done in animals, but nevertheless, some of those case studies where someone with autism was given a probiotic and not only their gastrointestinal symptoms had improved, but also some of the abnormal behavior that's associated with autism also improved. And these are the abstracts of some of those studies that I looked at for those slides. So stress seems to affect everything, but certainly stress affects the brain-gut or gut-brain axis as well. We know that in patients with inflammatory bowel disease, people with irritable bowel syndrome, peptic ulcer disease, GERD, often the symptoms are worsened or exacerbated, and even if someone is in remission, the symptoms can come back when they're exposed to stress. And we also know that even if someone doesn't have inflammatory bowel disease, just exposure to stress sometimes can increase GI motility. Certainly, you've probably heard of people that before going to a job interview, they're so nervous and they go to the bathroom frequently. Or the other way around, sometimes people get very constipated when they're under a lot of stress. What's interesting with respect to the brain-gut axis is that mast cells profoundly affect the physiology of our GI tract. And what they do is they translate stress signals into releasing a wide range of neurotransmitters and pro-inflammatory cytokines. So melatonin has been studied as a mediator of the brain-gut axis, and it has actually shown to be protective against some of the stress-induced lesions in the GI tract, which is very, very interesting. And that's the study that I got that from. So we know that the relationship between the gut and the brain is bidirectional. We know that the signaling from the gut microbiota affects the brain, and we know the signaling from the brain also affects the gut microbiome, and it does that by means of neural, endocrine, immune, and humoral links. And we also know that this sort of network, this communication network, includes the central nervous system, the spine, the autonomic nervous system, the enteric nervous system, and even the hypothalamus-pituitary axis. And we also know that enteric microbiota play a very important role in this brain-gut axis. This is the diagram that sort of shows the relationship between all the different neurotransmitters and the enteric nervous system and the brain and so on. Exercise seems to be good for everything, but certainly exercise is also good for maintaining healthy microbiota, but also creating a healthy microbiota. They looked at the microbiota of fit and physically active people, and they found that they were producing high amounts of butyrates. Butyrates are anti-inflammatory, and one of the signs of having healthy gut health is looking at the production of butyrates. And what they also found was physical activity that was performed at low dose, but on a regular basis, seemed to really help support the growth of good bacteria in the gut. And the more sedentary someone is, the more they have long periods of inactivity, the more this is going to affect the gut microbiome adversely. So exercise can be used as an adjunct therapy for any condition that is related to dysbiosis. And these are all the studies that I looked at to put that slide together. So earlier today, someone was talking about our cells having a circadian rhythm. Well, so do the gut bacteria. They also have a circadian rhythm. The studies with the circadian rhythm were both done in mice and humans. And what they found was that when they would induce jet lag in mice, they would develop dysbiosis. And jet lag-induced dysbiosis would lead to glucose intolerance in the mice and then eventually obesity. And this was transferable through their, through their stool to germ-free mice. So perhaps in people who are frequent flyers and shift workers, if they have metabolic disturbances, if they have autoimmune disorders, maybe considering probiotics as part of their treatment is also important. And these are the studies related to that. Now, this study caught my eye. I'm sure most of you heard of this. I think it was maybe in the news as well. The Weizmann Institute study, there's actually two studies. They were published back-to-back in the Journal of Cell in September. And in that particular study, they looked at what they did is they took a number of healthy volunteers, I think it was about 20 or 25 people, and they put 15 of them on a multi-strain probiotic. It was an 11-strain probiotic. And they also had the other half of the group take a placebo, and they were on it for about 4 weeks. After 4 weeks, what they did is they did colonoscopies and upper endoscopy, which is basically gastroscopy. And what they found from a clinical perspective is very, very interesting. And this is very exciting for me because when I work with patients and I put them on probiotics, I don't always get the response that I want. And it's always been a puzzle for me. Why is it that some people with IBS do so well when they take probiotics and others do so poorly? So even though this was a small study, I think it's the beginning of hopefully many more studies to talk about this. So what happened was, of the 15 people who took the multi-strain probiotic, 6 did really well. When they did the colonoscopy and the upper endoscopy, they saw that the bacteria had colonized their digestive tract. So the researchers called those people persisters, and I called them responders. These were people who responded to the treatment. 9 of the people who were taking the probiotics, when they did the biopsies, they were not able to find any of the strains that were in the probiotics that were used. So they called those people resistors, and I call them non-responders. So what this study is suggesting is that not everybody benefits equally from the same sort of standard probiotic supplementation. I have to say clinically, I can attest that I have also seen that in my experience. What the researchers also found was that they could predict who was going to be a resistor and who was going to be a persister. In other words, who was going to respond and who wasn't going to respond to treatment. So, of course, further research is needed in this area, but I find it very fascinating. Aaron Elenov was interviewed about that study. He was the lead researcher of that study, and he said, probiotics should not be universally given as a one-size-fits-all supplement, and I 100% agree with that. I think the future of probiotics, talking about biohacking, I guess this is part of the biohacking, the future of probiotics will be that probiotics will be tailored to an individual based on their gut microbiota. There's a company in Toronto that approached the college where I teach at, and then they approached me. And they were saying that, they analyze the patient's stool, and then based on what is in excess or deficient, they prescribe or they make a probiotic for the patient. So I got very excited because I've been waiting for this for a long time. But then when I looked into it further, they actually said it was too expensive for them to do that. So they were just giving a multi-strain probiotic to everyone. So obviously that was very disappointing. But I think that's in the near future, that's exactly what's going to happen. And this was the abstract of the study that I just shared with you. In the second Wiseman study, this was also interesting. This was a separate study. They took 21 healthy volunteers, and they put them all on antibiotics. Before putting them on antibiotics, though, they took a third of the people, and they looked at their gut flora, and they made a probiotic based on their gut flora. After the whole group finished the course of antibiotics, they put 1/3 on probiotics that were made from their own stool. They put another third on that same multi-strain probiotic that they had used in the previous study, and then a third got placebo. And what they found was those who were put on probiotics made from their own stool within a very short period were able to rebound, and their gut flora became normal. And the other groups, both the placebo and the group that was taking the multi-strain probiotic, it took much, much longer for their gut bacteria to turn back to normal. Of course, both these studies are small. They're not perfect, but from a clinical perspective, I think they are very significant. And this is the abstract of that study. So are there any risks associated with probiotics? Well, in Canada, we have Health Canada, and Health Canada is very rigorous in terms of how natural health products are made. In fact, there's a division at Health Canada called Natural Health Products, NHP, that looks at all the health products in Canada. So in Canada, probiotics they can't pretend to say what's in it. They have to actually, the strains that are on the label have to be in the supplement. Having said that, though, we still don't know when we buy a probiotic from someone's shelf what the number of live bacteria in it really is going to be. It's hard to know how much that's going to be. And in the US, of course, it's a bit more freer, and so there's safety concerns and purity and potency concerns with the probiotics found in the US. Finally, I think for me, the most important sort of risk that I associate with probiotics is the fact that every single one of us is different. Every single one of us has microbiota that are diverse. And ultimately, if we want to get great results, we can't assume that just because a probiotic supplement worked for one person, it's going to work for us as well. So this woman tells her friend, I take a probiotic. Ed swears by beer and peanuts. So are probiotics really necessary? I think they're absolutely necessary. However, I'm not convinced that the supplements that we buy in the stores are necessarily good for everybody. I think the future will be individualizing the probiotics to the gut flora. Okay. No, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We have a couple of questions.
Okay, thank you.
One of the questions that came up was that can probiotics cause like small bacterial overgrowth, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth?
Yes, they can. That's why I always tell my patients, don't just go to a store and just probiotics just because everyone else is taking it. Of course, it's not the only reason that SIBO can happen in somebody, but certainly it can be a contributing factor, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what about, if you want to change the large intestine, microbiota, what would you suggest?
I think eating fermented foods, I think, is a good place to start. Like starting to eat foods that are high in good bacteria, eating fruits and vegetables that come from the soil. I think one of the speakers this morning also was talking about that. And if you're going to take a probiotic, again, the research is more sort of for a multi-strain probiotic. The high doses can cause gas, bloating, and bother a lot of people. So maybe not super high dose, maybe around 10 to 50 billion in that range might be. But again, it's really individualized, so it really depends on the person. But going with the foods, I think, is the best way to go.
And then what do you think about this? Ben Greenfield mentioned fecal transplant.
Yes, so fecal transplant is a great idea. In Canada, in Ontario, I should say, I haven't seen too many people do it. I don't think it's very common, but I have actually sent some of my patients to the States to have it done. Especially with people with Crohn's, colitis, where it's just not getting better. Fecal transplant can make a big difference in terms of reducing inflammation. Yeah.
And last thing about the testing.
Yes.
What's your thought about Viome or Ubiome testing?
I think they're all great. I mean, it depends, of course, where you are, and the cost can be, it can be very costly for people, for patients. I also like the GI MAPS test that's done in the US, where they look at the genes, the genetics of the microbiome in people's stool. Comprehensive stool analysis can also be effective. I mean, they're all, yeah, they can all be a great tool from a clinical perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, for the right person, yeah.
Thank you so much.